A militia is a military or paramilitary force that comprises civilian members, as opposed to a professional standing army of regular, full-time military personnel. Militias may be raised in times of need to support regular troops or serve as a pool of available manpower for regular forces to draw from. When acting independently, militias are generally unable to hold ground against regular forces. Militias commonly support regular troops by skirmishing, holding fortifications, or conducting irregular warfare, instead of undertaking offensive campaigns by themselves. However, militias may also engage in defense activities to protect a community, its territory, property, and laws. For example, naval militias may comprise fishermen and other civilians which are organized and sanctioned by a state to enforce its maritime boundaries. Beginning in the late 20th century, some militias, in particular officially recognized and sanctioned militias of a government, act as professional forces, while still being part-time or on-call organizations. For instance, members of the part-time United States National Guard militia are considered professional soldiers, as they are trained to the same standards that their full-time, active-duty counterparts are. Militias may nonetheless operate outside of a state's legal jurisdiction, taking the form of a private military force, irregular military, or guerrilla forces. In countries with conscription, the term militia may refer to the entire able-bodied population available, legally obliged, or who actually respond to be called to arms. In Russia and some countries of the former Soviet Union, an official reserve army composed of citizen soldiers is known as the militia. The word militia dates back to ancient Rome, and more recently to at least 1590 when it was recorded in a book by Sir John Smythe, Certain Discourses Military, with the meanings, a military force, a body of soldiers, and military affairs, a body of military discipline. The word militia comes from ancient Latin, in which it meant defense service, as distinguished from a body of armed defenders which would be vulgus militum. The term is used by several countries with the meaning of defense activity, indicating it is taken directly from Latin. The first notable militia in French history was the resistance of the Gauls to invasion by the Romans until they were defeated by Julius Caesar. Centuries later, Joan of Arc organized and led a militia until her capture and execution in 1431. This settled the succession to the French crown and laid the basis for the formation of the modern nation of France. During the French Revolution, the National Guard was a political home defense militia. The Levée en Masse was a conscription army used during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. At the time of the Franco-Prussian War, the Parisian National Guard engaged the Prussian army and later rebelled against the Versailles army under Marshal MacMahon. Under German occupation during World War II, a militia usually called the French Resistance emerged to conduct a guerrilla war of attrition against German forces and prepare the way for the D-Day Allied invasion of France. The resistance militia were opposed by the collaborationist French militia, the paramilitary police force of the German puppet state of Vichy. Although defunct from 1871 until 2016, the French National Guard has now been re-established for homeland security purposes. The earliest reports of Germanic militias was the system of hundreds described in AD 98 by the Roman historian Tacitus as the centini. They were similar in nature to the Anglo-Saxon FYRD. Freikorps, German for Freikorps, was originally applied to voluntary armies. The first Freikorps were recruited by Frederick II of Prussia during the 7 Years' War. These troops were regarded as unreliable by regular armies, so they were mainly used as sentries and for minor duties. During the Napoleonic occupation, organizations such as the Lutzow Freikorps fought against the occupiers and later joined the Allied forces as regular soldiers. However, after 1918, the term was used for nationalist paramilitary organizations that sprang up around Germany as soldiers returned in defeat from World War I. They were one of the many Weimar paramilitary groups active during that time. They received considerable support from Gustav Nitzsche, the German defense minister, who used them to crush the Spartacist League with enormous violence, including the murders of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg on January 15, 1919. Militia were also used to put down the Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919. They were officially disbanded in 1920, resulting in the ill-fated Kapp Putsch in March 1920. The Einwohnerwehr, active in Germany from 1919 to 1921, was a paramilitary citizens' militia consisting of hundreds of thousands of mostly former servicemen. Formed by the Prussian Ministry of the Interior on April 15, 1919, to allow citizens to protect themselves from looters, armed gangs, and revolutionaries, the Einwohnerwehr was under the command of the local Reichswehr regiments, which supplied its guns. In 1921, the Berlin government dissolved the Einwohnerwehr. Many of its members went on to join the Nazi Party. In 1921 the Nazi Party created the Sturmabteilung, SA, Storm Detachment, Brown Shirts, which was the first paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party and served as a Nazi militia whose initial assignment was to protect Nazi leaders at rallies and assemblies. The SA also took part in street battles against the forces of rival political parties and violent actions against Jews. From the SA sprung the Schutzstaffel, SS, Protective Squadron, which grew to become one of the largest and most powerful groups in Nazi Germany, which Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS from 1929, envisioned as an elite group of guards. The Waffen-SS, the military branch of the SS, became a de facto fourth branch of the Wehrmacht. In 1944 to 1945, as World War II came to a close in Europe, the German High Command deployed increasing numbers of Volkssturm units to combat duties. These regiments were composed of men, women, and children too old, young or otherwise unfit for service in the Wehrmacht, German regular army. Their primary role was assisting the army with fortification duties and digging anti-tank ditches. As the shortage of manpower became severe, they were used as front-line infantry, most often in urban settings. Due to the physical state of members, almost non-existent training and shortage of weapons, there was not much the Volkssturm could do except act like shields for regular army units. The obligation to serve in the militia, also known as the constitutional force, in England derives from a common law tradition, and dates back to Anglo-Saxon times. The tradition was that all able-bodied males were liable to be called out to serve in one of two organizations. These were the posse comitatus, an ad hoc assembly called together by a law officer to apprehend lawbreakers, and the FYRD, a military body intended to preserve internal order or defend the locality against an invader. The latter developed into the militia, and was usually embodied by a royal warrant. Service in each organization involved different levels of preparedness. With the decay of the feudal system and the military revolution of the 16th century, the militia began to become an important institution in English life. It was organized on the basis of the shire county, and was one of the responsibilities of the Lord Lieutenant, a royal official, usually a trusted nobleman. Each of the county hundreds was likewise the responsibility of a deputy lieutenant, who relayed orders to the justices of the peace or magistrates. Every parish furnished a quota of eligible men, whose names were recorded on muster rolls. Likewise, each household was assessed for the purpose of finding weapons, armor, horses, or their financial equivalent, according to their status. The militia was supposed to be mustered for training purposes from time to time, but this was rarely done. The militia regiments were consequently ill-prepared for an emergency, and could not be relied upon to serve outside their own counties. This state of affairs concerned many people. Consequently, an elite force was created, composed of members of the militia who were prepared to meet regularly for military training and exercise. These were formed into trained band regiments, particularly in the City of London, where the artillery ground was used for training. The trained bands performed an important role in the English Civil War on the side of Parliament, in marching to raise the siege of Gloucester, September 5, 1643. Except for the London trained bands, both sides in the Civil War made little use of the militia, preferring to recruit their armies by other means. As successful English settlement of North America began to take place in 1607 in the face of the hostile intentions of the powerful Spanish, and of the native populations, it became immediately necessary to raise militia amongst the settlers. The militia in Jamestown saw constant action against the Powhatan Federation and other native polities. In the Virginia Company's other outpost, Bermuda, fortification began immediately in 1612. A Spanish attack in 1614 was repulsed by 2 shots fired from the incomplete Castle Island's fortifications manned by Bermudian militiamen. In the 19th century, Fortress Bermuda would become Britain's Gibraltar of the West, heavily fortified by a regular army garrison to protect the Royal Navy's headquarters and dockyard in the western Atlantic. In the 17th century, however, Bermuda's defense was left entirely in the hands of the militia. In addition to requiring all male civilians to train and serve in the militia of their parish, the Bermudian militia included a standing body of trained artillerymen to garrison the numerous fortifications which ringed New London, St. George's. This standing body was created by recruiting volunteers, and by sentencing criminals to serve as punishment. The Bermudian militiamen were called out on numerous occasions of war, and, on one notable occasion, to quell rioting privateers. The 1707 Acts of Union made Bermudian and other English militiamen British. The militia in Bermuda came to include a troop of horse, mounted infantry, and served alongside volunteers and, from 1701, a small body of regulars. The militia faded away after the American War of 1812 when the Parliament of Bermuda declined to renew the Militia Act. This resulted from the build-up of the regular Army Bermuda garrison along with Bermuda's development as the headquarters and dockyard of the North America and West Indies station of the Royal Navy, which made the militia seem excess to need. Vast sums of the imperial defense expenditure were lavished on fortifying Bermuda during the 19th century, and the British government cajoled, implored, begged, and threatened the colonial legislature for 80 years before it raised a militia and volunteer units, in 1894 and 1894 respectively. Although the militia had historically been an infantry force, many units in Britain had been retasked as militia artillery from the 1850s onward due to the increased importance of the coastal artillery defences, and the new militia unit in Bermuda followed suit. Titled the Bermuda Militia Artillery, it was badged and uniformed as part of the Royal Artillery, and tasked with the garrison artillery role, manning coastal batteries. As in Britain, recruitment was of volunteers who engaged for terms of service, whereas the Bermuda Volunteer Rifle Corps was organized on the same lines as Volunteer Rifle Corps in Britain. Recruitment to the BVRC was restricted to whites, but the BMA recruited primarily colored, those who were not entirely of European heritage, other ranks, though its officers were all white until 1953. Neither unit was reorganized in 1908 when the militia, volunteer force, and yeomanry in Britain merged into the territorial force, but the BVRC was reorganized as a territorial in 1921 and the BMA in 1926. The BVRC name was not modified to Bermuda Rifles until 1951, however, and the Bermuda Militia Artillery, and from 1939 the Bermuda Militia Infantry, continued to be titled as militia until amalgamated with the Bermuda Rifles in 1965 to form the Bermuda Regiment. In British India, a special class of militia was established in 1907. This took the form of the Frontier Corps, which consisted of locally recruited full-time auxiliaries under British officers. Their role combined the functions of tribal police and border guards deployed along the northwest frontier. Regional units included the Zhab Militia, the Kurram Militia, and the Chagai Militia. After 1946 the Frontier Corps became part of the modern Pakistan Army. Until the Glorious Revolution in 1688 the Crown and Parliament were in strong disagreement. The English Civil War left a rather unusual military legacy. Both Whigs and Tories distrusted the creation of a large standing army not under civilian control. The former feared that it would be used as an instrument of royal tyranny. The latter had memories of the new model army and the anti-monarchical social and political revolution that it brought about. Both preferred a small standing army under civilian control for defensive deterrence and to prosecute foreign wars, a large navy as the first line of national defense, and a militia composed of their neighbors as additional defense and to preserve domestic order. Consequently, the English Bill of Rights, 1689, declared, amongst other things, that the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with consent of Parliament, is against law, and that the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defence suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. This implies that they are fitted to serve in the militia, which was intended to serve as a counterweight to the standing army and preserve civil liberties against the use of the army by a tyrannical monarch or government. The Crown still, in the British Constitution, controls the use of the army. This ensures that officers and enlisted men swear an oath to a politically neutral head of state, and not to a politician. While the funding of the standing army subsists on annual financial votes by Parliament, the Mutiny Act, superseded by the Army Act, and now the Armed Forces Act is also renewed on an annual basis by Parliament. If it lapses, the legal basis for enforcing discipline disappears, and soldiers lose their legal indemnity for acts committed under orders. With the creation of the British Empire, militias were also raised in the colonies, where little support could be provided by regular forces. Overseas militias were first raised in Jamestown, Virginia, and in Bermuda, where the Bermuda militia followed over the next 2 centuries a similar trajectory to that in Britain. In 1707 the Acts of Union united the Kingdom of England with the Kingdom of Scotland. The Scottish Navy was incorporated into the Royal Navy. The Scottish military, as opposed to naval, forces merged with the English, with pre-existing regular Scottish regiments maintaining their identities, though command of the new British Army was from England. How this affected militias either side of the border is unclear. The Militia Act 1757 created a more professional force. Better records were kept, and the men were selected by ballot to serve for longer periods. Specific provision was made for members of the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, to be exempted, as conscientious objectors, from compulsory enlistment in the militia. Proper uniforms and better weapons were provided, and the force was embodied from time to time for training sessions. The militia was widely embodied at various times during the French and Napoleonic Wars. It served at several vulnerable locations, and was particularly stationed on the south coast and in Ireland. A number of camps were held at Brighton, where the militia regiments were reviewed by the Prince Regent. This is the origin of the song Brighton Camp. The militia could not be compelled to serve overseas, but it was seen as a training reserve for the army, as bounties were offered to men who opted to exchange from the militia to the regular army. The Parliament of Ireland passed an act in 1715 raising regiments of militia in each county and county corporate. Membership was restricted to Protestants between the ages of 16 and 60. In 1793, during the Napoleonic Wars, the Irish militia were reorganized to form 37 county and city regiments. While officers of the reorganized force were Protestant, membership of the other ranks was now made available to members of all denominations. In the late 17th century, numerous individuals in the Kingdom of Scotland, then in a personal union with the Kingdom of England, called for the resurrection of a Scottish militia, with the understated aim of protecting the rights of Scots in Great Britain. After Scotland became part of the Kingdom of Great Britain, the Militia Act 1757 did not apply there. The traditional Scottish militia system continued, with only certain settlements in Scotland playing host to a militia regiment. This was viewed with resentment among some in Scotland, and the Militia Club was formed to promote the raising of a Scottish militia. The Militia Club, along with several other Scottish gentlemen's clubs, became the crucible of the Scottish Enlightenment. The Militia Act 1797 empowered Scottish Lord Lieutenants to raise and command militia regiments in each of the counties, stewartries, cities, and places under their jurisdiction. Although muster rolls were prepared as late as 1820, the element of compulsion was abandoned, and the militia transformed into a volunteer force, revived by the Militia Act 1852. It was intended to be seen as an alternative to the regular army. men would volunteer and undertake basic training for several months at an army depot. Thereafter, they would return to civilian life, but report for regular periods of military training, usually on the weapons ranges, and an annual 2-week training camp. In return, they would receive military pay and a financial retainer, a useful addition to their civilian wage. Of course, many saw the annual camp as the equivalent of a paid holiday. The militia thus appealed to agricultural laborers, colliers, and the like, men in casual occupations, who could leave their civilian job and pick it up again. Until 1852 the militia were an entirely infantry force, but from that year a number of county infantry regiments were converted to artillery and new ones raised. In 1877 the militia of Anglesey and Monmouthshire were converted to engineers. Under the reforms, introduced by Secretary of State for War Hugh Childers in 1881, the remaining militia infantry regiments were redesignated as numbered battalions of regiments of the line, ranking after the 2 regular battalions. Typically, an English, Welsh or Scottish regiment would have 2 militia battalions, the 3rd and 4th, and Irish regiments 3, numbered 3rd to 5th. The militia must not be confused with the volunteer units created in a wave of enthusiasm in the second half of the 19th century. In contrast with the volunteer force, and the similar yeomanry cavalry, they were considered rather plebeian. The militia was transformed into the special reserve by the military reforms of Haldane in the reforming post-1906 Liberal government. In 1908 the militia infantry battalions were redesignated as reserve and a number were amalgamated or disbanded. Numbered territorial force battalions, ranking after the special reserve, were formed from the volunteer units at the same time. Altogether, 101 infantry battalions, 33 artillery regiments and 2 engineer regiments of special reservists were formed. Upon mobilization, the special reserve units would be formed at the depot and continue training while guarding vulnerable points in Britain. The special reserve units remained in Britain throughout the First World War, but their rank and file did not, since the object of the special reserve was to supply drafts of replacements for the overseas units of the regiment. The original militiamen soon disappeared, and the battalions simply became training units. The Special Reserve reverted to its militia designation in 1921, then to Supplementary Reserve in 1924, though the units were effectively placed in suspended animation until disbanded in 1953. The name was briefly revived in the Military Training Act 1939, in the aftermath of the Munich crisis. Leslie Horbilicia, Secretary of State for War, wished to introduce a limited form of conscription, not known in peacetime Britain since the militia of the early 19th century and previously. It was thought that calling the conscripts militiamen would make this more acceptable, as it would render them distinct from the rest of the army. Only single men aged 20 up to the day before their 22nd birthday were to be conscripted, for 6 months full-time training before discharge into the reserve, with a free suit of civilian clothing. Although the first intake was called up in late July 1939, the declaration of war on September 3 entailed implementation of full-time conscription for all men aged 18 to 41, superseding the militia, never to be revived. 3 units still maintain their militia designation in the British Army. These are the Royal Monmouthshire Royal Engineers, formed in 1539, the Jersey Field Squadron, the Royal Militia Island of Jersey, formed in 1337, and the Royal Alderney Militia, created in the 13th century and reformed in 1984. Additionally, the Atholl Highlanders are a ceremonial infantry militia maintained by the Duke of Atholl. They are the only legal private army in Europe. Various other part-time, home defense organizations have been raised during times of crisis or perceived threat, although without the word militia in their title. These have included Volunteer Corps, part of the British anti-invasion preparations of 1803 to 1805. Yeomanry, volunteer cavalry initially raised in the Napoleonic Wars. Volunteer Force, from 1857 to 1908. Volunteer Training Corps, 1914 to 1918. National Defense Companies, 1936 to 1939. Home Guard, initially local defense volunteers, 1940 to 1944 and 1951 to 1957. Ulster Defence Regiment, 1970 to 1992. Home Service Force, 1982 to 1992. The various non-state paramilitary groups involved in the 20th century conflicts in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland, such as the various Irish Republican Army groups and Loyalist paramilitaries, could also be described as militias and are occasionally referred to as such. The Ulster Defence Regiment, UDR, was a locally raised professional militia instituted by an Act of Parliament in December 1969, becoming operational on April 1, 1970. Created as a non-partisan force to defend Northern Ireland against armed attack or sabotage, it eventually peaked at 11 battalions with 7,559 men and women. 197 soldiers of the UDR were killed as active servicemen, with a further 61 killed after leaving the regiment, mostly by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. As a result of defence cuts, it was eventually reduced to 7 battalions before being amalgamated with the Royal Irish Rangers in 1992 to form the Home Service Battalions of the Royal Irish Regiment. The history of militia in the United States dates from the colonial era, such as in the American Revolutionary War. Based on the English system, colonial militias were drawn from the body of adult male citizens of a community, town, or local region. Because there was no standing English army before the English Civil War, and subsequently the English Army and later the British Army had few regulars garrisoning North America, colonial militias served a vital role in local conflicts, particularly in the French and Indian Wars. Before shooting began in the American War of Independence, American revolutionaries took control of the militia system, reinvigorating training and excluding men with loyalist inclinations. Regulation of the militia was codified by the Second Continental Congress with the Articles of Confederation. The revolutionaries also created a full-time regular army, the Continental Army, but, because of manpower shortages, the militia provided short-term support to the regulars in the field throughout the war. In colonial-era Anglo-American usage, militia service was distinguished from military service in that the latter was normally a commitment for a fixed period of time of at least a year, for a salary, whereas militia was only to meet a threat, or prepare to meet a threat, for periods of time expected to be short. Militia persons were normally expected to provide their own weapons, equipment, or supplies, although they may later be compensated for losses or expenditures. A related concept is the jury, which can be regarded as a specialized form of militia convened to render a verdict in a court proceeding, known as a petit jury or trial jury, or to investigate a public matter and render a presentment or indictment, grand jury. With the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and Article 1 Section 8 of the United States Constitution, control of the Army and the power to direct the militia of the states was concurrently delegated to the federal Congress. The militia clauses gave Congress authority for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, and the states retained authority to appoint officers and to impose the training specified by Congress. Proponents describe a key element in the concept of militia was that to be genuine it not be a select militia, composed of an unrepresentative subset of the population. This was an argument presented in the ratification debates. The first legislation on the subject was the Militia Act of 1792, which provided, in part, that each and every free able-bodied white male citizen of the respective states, resident therein, who is or shall be of age of 18 years, and under the age of 45 years, except as is hereinafter accepted, shall severally and respectively be enrolled in the militia. Every citizen, so enrolled and notified, shall, within 6 months thereafter, provide himself with a good musket or firelock. Prior to the War of Independence, the officers of militia units were commissioned by the royal governors. During the war, they were commissioned either by the legislature or the chief executive of the state. After the war, commissions were typically granted by the state's chief executive. Militias did not operate independently of the state governments but were under the command of the civil government just like the regular military forces. 24 of the current U.S. states maintain state defense forces in the form of a constitutional militia in addition to the National Guard, which is shared with the U.S. government. These states include Alabama, Alaska, California, Connecticut, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Missouri, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, Vermont, and Virginia. In addition, the territory of Puerto Rico has a defense force. During the 19th century, each of the states maintained its militia differently, some more than others. American militias saw action in the various Indian Wars, the War of 1812, the American Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. Sometimes militia units were found to be unprepared, ill-supplied, and unwilling. Prior to the Civil War, militia units were sometimes used by Southern states for slave control. Formed in 1860, Republican Party-affiliated Wide Awakes clubs were quick to take action to defend persons against Southern slave hunters. In California, the militia carried out campaigns against bandits and against the Indians at the direction of its governor between 1850 and 1866. During Reconstruction after the Civil War, Republican state governments had militias composed almost entirely of freed slaves and populist whites. Their deployment to maintain order in the former Confederate states caused increased resentment among many Southern whites. After the American Civil War, secret groups like the Ku Klux Klan and Knights of the White Camellia arose quickly across the South, reaching a peak in the late 1860s. Even more significant in terms of effect were private militias, paramilitary organizations that formed starting in 1874, including the White League in Louisiana, which quickly formed chapters in other states, the Red Shirts in Mississippi in 1875, and with force in South Carolina and North Carolina, and other white line militias and rifle clubs. In contrast to the KKK, these paramilitary organizations were open, members were often well known in their communities. Nevertheless, they used force, intimidation, and violence, including murder, to push out Republican office holders, break up organizing, and suppress freedmen's voting and civil rights. The paramilitary groups were described as the military arm of the Democratic Party and were instrumental in helping secure Democratic victories in the South in the elections of 1876. The Militia Act of 1903 divided what had been the militia into what it termed the organized militia, created from portions of the former state guards to become state National Guard units, and the unorganized militia consisting of all males from ages 17 to 45, with the exception of certain officials and others, which is codified in 10 U.S.C. 311. Some states, such as Texas, California, and Ohio, created separate state defense forces for assistance in local emergencies. Congress later established a system of dual enlistment for the National Guard, so that anyone who enlisted in the National Guard also enlisted in the U.S. Army. When the U.S. Air Force was established as an independent service in 1947, the National Guard was further divided into the Army National Guard and the Air National Guard. Under this construct, the 1933 Defense Act's dual enlistment facet was further amended so that enlisted soldiers and commissioned officers in the Army National Guard were also enlisted or commissioned in the reserve component of the U.S. Army. Enlisted airmen and commissioned officers in the Air National Guard were also enlisted or commissioned in the Air Reserve Component, ARC, of the U.S. Air Force. The 20th century saw the rise of militia organizations in the United States. These private militias often have an anti-government outlook and are not under the civil authority of the states. Privately organized citizen militia-related groups blossomed in the mid-1990s. Many militia groups are based on religious or political extremism and some are regarded as hate groups. In the 2008 decision of the Supreme Court, in District of Columbia v. Heller, the de jure definition of militia as used in United States jurisprudence was discussed. The court's opinion made explicit, in its obiter dicta, that the term militia, as used in colonial times in this originalist decision, included both the federally organized militia and the citizen organized militias of the several states. The militia in colonial America consisted of a subset of the people, those who were male, able-bodied, and within a certain age range. 7. Although the militia consists of all able-bodied men, the federally organized militia may consist of a subset of them. 23. The most important previous activity of the Texas militia was the Texas Revolution in 1836. Texans declared independence from Mexico while they were defeated during the Battle of the Alamo, in March 1836. On April 21, 1836, led by Sam Houston, the militia attacked the Mexican army at their camp, in the Battle of San Jacinto near the present city of Houston. Following the war, some militia units reorganized into what was later to be known as the Texas Rangers, which was a private, volunteer effort for several years before becoming an official organization. After Texas joined the Union of the United States in 1845, Texas militia units participated in the Mexican-American War. In 1861 Texas joined the other Confederate states in seceding from the Union, and Texas militias played a role in the American Civil War until it ended in 1865. Texas militiamen joined Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, a volunteer militia, and fought with him during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Some of the training of the Rough Riders took place in San Pedro Park, in the north-central part of San Antonio near the present site of San Antonio College. When a muster of the militia proposed to train there on April 19, 1994, they were threatened with arrest, even though the charter of San Pedro Park forbids exclusion of activities of that kind. This threat led to a change in the meeting site. Like many other American states, Texas maintains a recognized state militia, the Texas State Guard. In Bahrain, emergence of a small militia group Katibat al-Haydariyah was first seen in 2015. During the year, total 4 attacks were claimed by the group, including on August 22 and 24, 2015, in Muharraq, on September 10, 2015, in Al-Khamis, and on October 9, 2015, on Bahraini forces in the Al-Jafair region. Katibat al-Haydariyah is its own distinct organization that decries the Bahraini government, but Canada and the United Kingdom listed it as an alias for the larger Al-Ashta brigades, or the Saraya al-Ashta. After 4 years, the militia group re-emerged on social media in October 2019, to threaten new attacks on the island. It stated that they will not retreat from our goals of the downfall of the Al-Khalifa entity, and that soon, guns will open their mouths and they will hear the whiz of bullets. In Brazil, the word militia is heavily associated with paramilitary and drug-related criminal groups. Mexico has a history of various activities and insurrection by militia and paramilitary groups dating back several hundred years that include the exploits of historical figures such as Captain Manuel Pineda Muñoz and Francisco Pancho Villa. This also includes groups such as the Free-Colored Militia, the interracial militias of New Spain, colonial Mexico, the Camisas Doradas, and the contemporary Self-Defense Council of Michoacán. Free-colored militias were an important and at times critical organization in colonial Mexico. Prior to the 18th century, Spain's territories in the Americas were mainly defended through a series of Spanish military units being based in strategic coastal port cities and important economic centers. But as European rivals began to challenge the Spanish crown and their dominance in the New World, the Bourbon dynasty initiated a series of reforms, allowing people from their colonies to serve in the regular armies, as well as permitting local militias in their territories. While these groups began to integrate themselves into the official Spanish colonial militaries, free-colored militias have been reluctantly used since the mid-16th century. Palenques, or runaway slave communities, would often initiate slavery uprising in various cities and towns in New Spain, which made the colonial Spanish authorities uneasy about arming any free-colored individuals. Free-colored rebellions and violence in Mexico City impacted regional policy of New Spain towards blacks. Given this social context, the racial climate in which these free-colored militias first appeared was a hostile one, and the first militias often had conflicts within them between their free-colored and white commanders. The first large-scale recruitment of fee-colored militias was in response to the attack on Veracruz port in 1683 by Dutch pirate Lorenzo de Graaf, with free-colored soldiers being called in from Mexico City, Puebla, Orizaba, and other large colonial cities. Militias increasingly began to take shape and develop over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, but it's critical to understand that their development was not a linear progressive one. The experiences of militias in urban areas was vastly different from those in rural communities, and the role, influence, and duties of militias in the early 17th century were not the same as those of a century later. The critical stage for militia growth was during 1670 to 1762, where there was an increase of the militia's responsibilities and they gained a considerable amount of autonomy over their own affairs. The social impact of these free-colored militias added complexity to the race-based caste system that dominated the social landscape. Free-colored militias were structured to follow the tertio organizational model that was used by Spanish Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties. Tertios comprised 2,500 soldiers distributed among 10 companies, each under the leadership of a captain. Free-colored militias under the tertio system were headed by a sergeant-to-mayor, major, who became the senior operating officer in militias. Under the sergeant-to-mayor were the junior officers, which included one captain and alferez, lieutenant, per company, who were also aided by an adjutant, and subtenent, second lieutenant, after they were incorporated into the system after 1767. The captain had supreme authority within their company, only reporting to the sergeant-to-mayor when he could not control matters of the company. The alferez coordinated affairs with his captain and was next in line in command in his absence. Below the junior officers were ranking NCOs and up to 4 sergeants served per company. A cabo, corporal, was assigned to lead each squad of 25 soldiers. These NCOs were responsible for discipline of the soldiers and maintaining a limited record of individuals. Officers and first sergeants were the only soldiers in the free-colored militias to receive a monthly salary, with lower-rank soldiers only receiving pay when on campaigns. Their salaries came from the royal treasuries, alongside occasional supplementation by private contributions of prominent individuals. Who exactly constitutes as a free-colored person is subject to much debate and discussion. While the terms pardos, mulattoes, negros, and morenos were commonly used under the caste system that was in place during this era, their use in this context is much more complex, and who exactly qualified as who was a very fluid process, dependent on the social context of the time and place. Despite the lack of universal understanding of racial identification across New Spain, when they were faced with external threats to their organizations, free-colored militias showed great racial unity in these times, such as in the case of Huayatitlan, a small town of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. After a decree was passed in 1784 calling for the retirement of every free-colored officer and the disbandment of their militia, the Tos free-coloreds fiercely resisted. Free-colored soldiers refused to leave their posts and they dispatched to the capital in protests to defend their racially integrated organizations. This later inspired the community's other free-colored people to protest what they saw as other aggressions by the government, such as increasing tribute burdens. While some of the previous examples are historical, the current official view on the existence of such militias in Mexico, when they are not backed by the government, has been to always label them as illegal and to combat them in a military and a political way. Modern examples on the Mexican view on militias are the Chiapas conflict against the EZLN and against the EPR in Guerrero, where the government forces combated the upraised militias. And in a more recent case when civilian self-defense militias appeared during the Mexican War on Drugs, the government regulated them and transformed the militias into rural federal forces, and those who resisted were combated and imprisoned. Thank you for watching this video.